Good morning, everyone. My name is John Stotts. I'm the Director of Adult Faith Formation here at Christ the King Catholic Church. And as they used to say in Monty Python, for those of you who have been with us the past several weeks, and now for something completely different. Karl Rahner once famously wrote and said, "The Christian of the future will be a mystic or will not exist at all." Now, I happen to think he's right, but when many of us think of mysticism or mystics or mystical experience, oftentimes we can think of someone who's constantly having experiences of some intense emotional or sensory energy, someone floating in an ocean or caught up in rapturous love. But maybe this isn't what Rahner meant. And maybe this isn't quite what mystical experience is about. So for the next few weeks, to help us sort through what it might mean to be a Christian mystic with the help of a long Christian tradition and one figure in particular, I'd like to welcome Jacob Abell. Jacob is a doctoral student in the Department of Health, French. I just said the Department of Health. He is not with the Department of Health. He is with the Department of French and Italian, and he's pursuing joint PhDs in both French studies and comparative media analysis and practice. His research focuses on the representation of religious rituals in medieval poetry and prose, and also the reception of Dante in the Francophone world, focusing currently on disembodied experience in specific medieval manuscripts. He has a bachelor's from Baylor University and a master's in theological studies from Vanderbilt Divinity. He also enjoys producing short film projects and stage productions. Many of you, I'm sure, will remember him from presentations on Dante last spring. And if so, I'm sure you are as excited as I am to have him back with us. So, Jake, welcome.
Thank you, John. I feel welcome. And it is really delightful to be back with the good folks at CTK. So it's a pleasure to be here. I don't know what y'all's MO is for technology, but as we get started here, if any of you are in situations where you don't have loud noises or dogs or things of that nature, I would invite you to unmute yourselves whenever you're comfortable, for the simple reason that I feel a little less bizarre when I have the vaguest sensorial notion that we're together in the same space rather than me just talking at a bunch of silent images. So even if it's just the hum and gentle background noise of your laptops and the occasional chortle or boo in response to what I'm saying, that's very helpful for me. So if you do want to unmute yourself, even a couple of you, that's very helpful. If not, that's okay too. So let me introduce the next couple of weeks here in some waves, and let me start with just one more quick word about me, and we'll get that out of the way. So the first thing to say is that I'm in the last year of my doctoral program. I'm defending my dissertation on February 1st. Prayers of petition, welcome. And I am not an expert from an academic perspective in the guy that I'm going to talk to you about for 3 weeks, Pseudo-Dionysius. I use him in my work. I study him. I read him devotionally, but I'm not a scholar of this guy. And I say that with some pride, actually, because I believe in the value of speaking to and talking from an experience of figures particularly in the life of the church who are important to us, from our own experience of reading and thinking in a way that's not trained or specialized, because that's of course how any of us come to so many of the ideas and thinkers that are important to us. These are the people we read at night or we underline in books on vacation, if you're weird like I am. And so at one level, I'm saying all this to suggest to you that while I know a fair amount about this man, about whom we know so little, and while his work is extremely important to me and shows up in the work that I do as a scholar, my primary investment in him is as somebody whose thinking is really transformative for my thinking. And I think that's a level on which we can all come to this anonymous Pseudo-Dionysius, the Areopagite. And so as a sort of fellow traveler on the road to trying to understand profound questions about the things John raised, about what is mysticism, What is its potential for a right and proper and creative experience of the Christian witness? I invite you to explore this figure with me for the next 3 weeks. By way of an itinerary about those 3 weeks, today is going to be the most sort of like gunshot approach to things. I'm going to throw at you a whole bunch of information and ideas to situate us a little bit in history and a little bit in a terrain of ideas. And so think of this as like the syllabus day on your first day of a college seminar. And then what we're going to do next week is you will all have read a small text, very short, 10 pages, that I'll circulate, that is a text by this figure, Pseudo-Dionysius. And that is the Mystical Theology. And we'll have more to say about that later, quite a bit actually. But next week, we'll talk about the text in some detail and bounce around some ideas about it, what's confusing, what's interesting, what resonates with your experience, what seems bizarre, maybe heretical, worth burning. And then in the third and final week, we'll take a more sort of personal and pastoral approach, let's say, and we'll talk with the help of John in some breakout groups about what any of this might mean for how we think about what God is, why any of that matters for our devotional lives, and indeed how it might matter for our social and political lives, both in the church and in various social bodies. And it's in that spirit that while this may be something completely different, as John said, from the work you have all been doing, my goal ultimately actually is to sort of bring this around in an unlikely way to very eminent, practical, applied social questions. And we're going to go a long way around to get there. So with that somewhat elliptical introduction, I want to first, this is my first shot at screen sharing a PowerPoint. So I'm gonna do this, guys. We're gonna do this. So if you'll just give me a moment to first share my screen, which I'm gonna do now. Share. Yes, good. And now I'm going to enter into presentation mode of this here PowerPoint, which I promise is not long and merely serves as the basis for us to talk together. You are not going to get hit with more than about 6 slides. So can everybody just give a thumbs up if they see this PowerPoint? Great. All right. So I've decided to entitle this 3-part series, Loving God in the Dark, an introduction to the theology of Pseudo-Dionysius. And as we're going to come to see, this guy, this theologian who we're going to talk about, is eminently obsessed with images of light and darkness, but in some very subtle ways. And those 2 images form the basis of his very creative construal of what humans are trying to do when they chase down this God that they variously want to know and in some cases to love. So loving God in the dark, that's where we're going. So first of all, by way of a very complicated introduction to who this person is, here is an image of Denis the Areopagite, first apostle to the Gauls. Okay, that should already seem really weird, and this for 3 reasons. First, the figure we're going to talk about was probably a 5th or 6th century Syriac-speaking monk. We're going to say a lot about that in the moment, but the first thing I want to draw your attention to is if this is a monk from the Syriac-speaking Christian East of late antiquity. Here we have an image depicted about 1,000 years later of this figure, Denis the Areopagite, who is called first apostle to the Gauls. Now that's weird because the Gauls, as some of you may know, are the French folk before France was France. So the question becomes, why is this Syriac monk being depicted here as an apostle to pre-France France? And the answer to that is because this person whose writings we're going to skim together in these 3 weeks is a kind of conflation of 3 different people. And what I mean by that is that over the course of Christian history and intellectual history more broadly, there are sort of 3 different targets that people try and identify as the identity of the writer of these texts. So the background here is we don't really know. This is an anonymous writer. And so the Dionysius of his title, Pseudo-Dionysius, refers specifically to somebody who appears in the book of Acts. And in a moment, not quite yet, I'm going to have John read us the relevant passage from the book of Acts that describes this person. But eventually, this figure from the book of Acts, who Paul converts, one of Paul's early converts to Christianity, is kind of mashed up in Christianity's historical memory with a 3rd century bishop of Paris, who's a martyr of the church. And you can actually see him holding his head, depicted in a most jolly way in medieval art. And here is that guy. Here is this figure who is sort of both identified with Paul's convert in the very first days of the Christian movement, who then gets also sort of remembered as this Denis, because he's got a similar name, who is a bishop of Paris. And now our kind of best scholarly guess is that this figure who wrote these texts was probably neither of these people, even though he's remembered as being some combination of both. He was probably, again, a 5th or 6th century monk. And we'll say more about that in detail in just a second. But I want to start with this deliberately confusing mashup of identities, because one of the questions that surrounds the author of these highly influential texts is, who the heck was this guy? And the short answer, conveniently for me, remains, we don't know. We absolutely don't know. And while there have been several more scholarly candidates that people have advanced for the identity of this person over the years, it remains an open-ended question. And so before we get into some more details about the sort of who's and what's of this Pseudo-Dionysius, I want to actually interject, interpolate that stream by asking why we should learn from him now. And I want to frame that conversation with 2 quotes. So the first one comes to us from the era of the Reformations. And this is great. One scholar writes that early reform-minded leaders of the Reformation era, such as Jean Gerson and Nicholas of Cusa, had drawn on Dionysius, his writings, for their pastoral insistence that Christian learning and spiritual contemplation belong together. So this is a figure who 1,000 years after he wrote was very important to Catholic thinkers in the Latin West, because he was seen as somebody who really understood that good Christian learning and philosophy and theology had to belong with practices of contemplation, of prayer, of devotion, that these things needed to happen together. And so for 1,000 years and more, the Pseudo-Dionysius has been associated with somebody who wanted to talk about theology in a way that emphasized the dual importance of these 2 things, learning in all kinds of senses and praying, and that these things have to go together. And much will be said about that in due course. But I want to pair this with another quote here. And this comes from Jean Leclerc, another scholar, who talks about the importance of Pseudo-Dionysius in our own time and says, 2 recent developments contribute to the relevance of Dionysius for our contemporary world. First is the importance he attributes to symbols in discursive thought and mysticism. Today, an ever greater recognition is given to the role of the imagination, and this has caused a number of thinkers to return to what they call a theology of symbolism. And the second thing that this scholar thinks is important for Dionysius in our time, which I don't go on to cite here, is that he can be a really important figure for interfaith dialogue. And we'll have more to say about that in week 3. But for now, I want to just focus on this word symbol and get this in our minds. What is a symbol? Well, that's a big question over which a lot of academic ink has been spilled. But for now, let's just say that symbols have to do with really important ways of understanding really important things in a way that's not always the most precise, right? We use symbols in poems and stories and art to try and signify things that are slippery, things that we see sideways and in flashes, whether that is the divine or the holy or the erotic, right? Symbols seem to have to do with human ways of grasping at and trying to say and signify things that are really hard to say and signify. And this Pseudo-Dionysius guy is really invested in thinking about symbols in that sense. And as we're going to see, he is very invested in trying to get us to understand that we can't know God without symbols in this sense. So hold that thought as well. So with that kind of framing, let's backtrack to this question of the who. Who is this theologian? Well, first and foremost, let's take a textual approach here. So he's the author of at least these sort of 5 groups of texts, okay? The first is the divine names, and that's a very long text that has to do with all of the different words or ideas or images that get associated with God, both in scripture and in other areas of tradition. We're not going to read that in part because it's rather long by comparison, but it is a more sort of longer version of the argument that we're going to read in the Mystical Theology, which is a blessedly short text. It's like 8 delicious, dense pages, and that's it. So we'll read that for next week. He also wrote 2 texts on hierarchy, which is a term that, as I understand it, he largely invents in its sort of usage with which he uses it. So there's the celestial hierarchy, which deals with questions of angelology and how the angels are arranged in God's heaven. And then there's the ecclesiastical hierarchy, which is his meditation on how it is that the different offices of the church and the laity are to be arranged together. And those texts are not so much about hierarchy in the sense we would think about it now. It's not so much about, okay, here's how power gets divvied out and works in an organization. It's really almost more like a kind of aesthetic picture of how things belong together to make a whole. And while we're not going to talk about that in this context, I invite all of you to consult these really interesting texts and see how an early church figure from the 500s and 600s is thinking about the relationship of how the church has different sort of members and functions on earth, and how that might reflect certain celestial functions and offices. It's all very exciting and beautiful stuff. And then there are some letters attributed to him. But again, amongst this group of texts, we're going to focus on this mystical theology, about which we'll have a lot to say at the end of our hour together. So the Pseudo-Dionysius is also a theologian whose journey of influence shows the history of the churches. And I want to give you a brief kind of Cliff Notes version of what that looks like. So basically, for anybody who encounters these texts that you see in front of you, right, in the history of the church, early on, it's very quickly assumed that the author of these texts is, in fact, the Dionysius who is described by Paul as this early convert of the church at Athens. And this is described in the book of Acts, chapter 17. And John Stotts, I'm wondering if I can call upon you to read this 2-verse passage that describes very briefly this experience of conversion.
When they heard about the resurrection of the dead, some of them sneered, but others said, "We want to hear you again on this subject." At that, Paul left the council. Some of the people became followers of Paul and believed. Among them was Dionysius, a member of the Areopagus, also a woman named Damaris, and a number of others.
Thank you, John. So that's a pretty sparse passage, right? But the author of these texts, identified as a Dionysius, is quickly identified by Christian tradition as the guy who Paul converts on the Areopagus at Athens, right? And part of why this is important is because the authority of these texts is really tied to the idea that the writer of these texts stands in really close proximity to Paul and the apostles, right? So as we all know, there's all kinds of texts besides the biblical texts that are floating around in the early Christian world, right? And the way that the early sort of Catholic and Orthodox churches, one of the ways that they try and determine which of these texts will be authoritative for Christian teaching and not, is to ask the question, well, did the writer of this text have a really close, intimate relationship to the apostles, right? And so the answer to that for a very long time here is, yes, absolutely, this guy did, because the author of these texts, we know, was this Dionysius who was converted on the Areopagus. So no problem. He knew Paul. He was converted by Paul. So therefore, the theology in these texts, it's good. It checks out. We can rely upon it. So there's that. But then flash forward to 1,000 years later real quick, just to sort of set the scope of his influence. In the midst of the Reformations, Martin Luther himself is going to have this really tumultuous relationship with Pseudo-Dionysius. And it starts off pretty good, and then it goes from bad, and then it goes to worse. And by the end of his life, you have Luther saying things like this: Dionysius is the most pernicious. He Platonizes more than he Christianizes. Now, clearly the operative term here is Platonizes. What does this mean? Well, the Pseudo-Dionysius is somebody who writes in a way that is constantly drawing upon the philosophy of Plato and Neoplatonism, which is just a description of the ongoing development of philosophy in the wake of Plato in the centuries following Plato, and indeed into the first centuries AD. And as many of you already know, one of the things that early Christians for the first several centuries of the life of the church are figuring out is, what is our relationship to these philosophers of Greek antiquity, right? Are these sort of proto-Christians whose philosophy we can sort of very quickly and without much change bring into the church, sort of like the Old Testament, right? And treat it as something that helps our minds or souls get ready for the gospel? Or do we need to take a more wary relationship to this stuff? Do we need to push all this Greek philosophy at arm's length? And you have, very different kinds of answers to that question, right, that emerge within individual theologians and the church's teaching. Martin Luther, right, is somebody who speaks for a lot of people throughout the centuries who came to feel kind of dubious about this Pseudo-Dionysius guy. Because Luther's saying, on balance, I think this guy is more of a Platonist. I think he's more of a philosopher than he is a Christian. And therefore, we shouldn't trust him as fully as we once thought we could. I disagree with this assessment, and I hope that by the end of these 3 weeks that you will too. But I want to flag it early on because it does show the way that this early Christian thinker from late antiquity is really invested in trying to understand the relationship of good ideas from philosophy, specifically about God and what we can say about God on the one hand, and what Christian revelation teaches from biblical sources and tradition. And so that's what makes this guy really controversial for over 1,000 years, right? And into our own time, is people are always trying to figure out the extent to which his engagement with philosophy easily maps onto a sense of Christian orthodoxy, or whether it chafes a little bit at those margins. And really where we're going to get concerned with that is on the question of language, which we're going to conclude our time with today. So just to flag a couple of other ways in which this controversy plays out over 1,000 years. One way that people have thought about how Pseudo-Dionysius is received by the churches is in this kind of 3-act play that I've got here. So you have his sort of heyday in the so-called heretical East, which I deliberately put in quotes, to the Byzantine East, to the Catholic West. Let's take each of those in turn. So the so-called heretical East here, right, is a description of the churches of the East outside of communion with both Rome and the churches of the Orthodox Byzantium, right, what we would think of today as the Eastern Orthodox churches. So these are the Syriac-speaking churches, for example, of the Arabian Peninsula and Persia and India, right, vibrant church traditions that gradually split in their theology and in some cases liturgical practice and in their hierarchical allegiance to the bishops of Constantinople and Rome. And we don't need to get into that except to say that it's in the far east of the Christian world that this Pseudo-Dionysius really is first very popular, and he takes off, and his writings are of great value. And then over time, kind of migrates and is made to be acceptable in the Byzantine churches of the East, which of course are still in communion with the Bishop of Rome. And this happens because of figures like Maximus the Confessor, who you may have heard of, who's a famous Byzantine Orthodox theologian, who's reading Pseudo-Dionysius, and he's seeing some of these potential problems with his account of Christ and of the Trinity, and he's very carefully sort of massaging all of this material into an Orthodox understanding. Now, again, we're not going to get concerned with the details of that at all in our time together. But the reason I want to bring it up is because if you have really good theologians in the Orthodox churches of the ancient world who are trying really, really hard to make this Pseudo-Dionysius guy work with orthodoxy, that tells us something about his perceived value then and now. Because if on the one hand you have the Martin Luthers of the world who will say things like, I don't know, this guy seems a lot more like a Platonist than a Christian, maybe we need to throw him out. You've also got lots of people like Maximus the Confessor who say, no, his ideas are so good and they're so nourishing for the life of the church that we've got to find some way to make him a licit, valuable theologian who can be at the table of Christian theology. Which brings us to a final concern. Christological problems, not our topic. Trinitarian concerns, it's not going to be our topic. Authorship concerns, this is a really fun topic. Because the Pseudo-Dionysius, who I started off by saying is sort of first identified with Paul's apostle, but we now know was probably writing 6 centuries later and was a Syriac monk, but we don't know the identity of this monk. This person who at times was thought to be a 3rd century bishop of Paris. Well, how do we know that? In other words, what's the point in this history of this story where people start to really work out this authorship question? And the answer to that is really in the Renaissance. And so in the 14 and 1500s, when the Reformations are really getting underway and when Renaissance culture is getting underway and the Middle Ages is coming to a close and it's transforming into something else, right? You have lots of people, both Catholic and Protestant, who are suddenly very, very interested in tracing the sources of documents to authenticate them or disauthenticate them. And part of this, of course, is because you have the printing press that we all know about, that's suddenly a hot new commodity. And so there's a new interest in printing, in the making of books, and the history of books. But you also have this new degree of contact between the Christian and indeed non-Christian East with thinkers in the European West. And this comes about in lots of ways. One of them, for example, are councils in the 1400s that try and bring patriarchs and bishops from Byzantium and from as far away as Egypt and elsewhere to Italy to try and get the church back together, and almost succeed in doing so. But that's a story for another day. But the reason why this is important for us is because the people who show up to these meetings, they're bringing big fat copies of Greek texts like Pseudo-Dionysius's writings with them. And people from the Latin West are finding this stuff in the saddlebags of their friends and saying, that's really interesting. Can we have a look at that? They say, yeah, sure. And the result is this new encounter with books, with manuscripts, with stuff that had been lost or not in wide circulation in the Latin Middle Ages for sometimes hundreds of years. Pseudo-Dionysius was one of those people who had sort of come in and out of fashion, had been lost and found again over the centuries in the Catholic West. And then starting in the 14 and 1500s, boom, it's like wildfire. He is rediscovered earlier by monks in the 11 and 1200s, but that ship really takes off in the 14 and 1500s. And that's when you get people like Lorenzo Valla in 1457, who says, you know, I'm reading this text really carefully, and I'm bringing all the powers of good textual criticism. I'm looking at, you know, style of writing. I'm looking at dates. I'm looking at descriptions of events in these texts. And I don't think that these texts could have been written by the person that they're claimed to be written by. And suddenly there's this explosive debate, right? Where people say, oh my gosh, what if this Pseudo-Dionysius wasn't Dionysius at all, right? And this is why he's called to this day Pseudo-Dionysius, as a recognition of this growing awareness in the 14 and 1500s that probably the person who claims to write these texts isn't who he says he is. And that's a big problem for a lot of people, because as we said at the beginning, the value of these texts for the churches, East, West, in communion with Rome, out of communion with Rome, the authority of these texts was often derived from a sense that they were written by someone who knew Paul. And so there's that apostolic line of succession, right? And if that's gone suddenly, well, for a lot of people, that meant this is no longer an authoritative text about God, about symbols, about all these questions that we're going to discover together when we get into the stuff. So why should that be any different for us? In other words, for Christians who are approaching these texts today, why is it that we should be invested in someone like Pseudo-Dionysius if figures in the Christian past saw fit to dismiss him out of hand because the claims about authorship turned out to be deeply false? To put it really bluntly, how should we or can we put stock into these texts that seem to be forgeries? Well, let's pause right there, because that's the big question, even in the 14 and 1500s. If these texts were not written by who they say they were, are they forgeries or are they something else? And of course, I'm going to make the case that it's something else. And that's why I have here Carl's solution: Santa and Shakespeare. What the heck does that mean? So a long time ago, in the galaxy far away, I had the pleasure of studying abroad for a semester in the Netherlands with a jolly man named Karl Utrecht, who was a bespectacled, large, handlebar mustache German literature professor. And he was teaching a bunch of young college students like me Shakespeare for the first time. And as many of you probably know, there's a similar question about authorship in Shakespeare, right? Did Shakespeare write his own plays? And people just are ready to destroy each other over this question, right? Was William Shakespeare the person who actually wrote his plays, or was it someone else? Was it Edward de Vere? Was it a woman? Was it someone we don't know? And Karl peered over his glasses and said with his thick German accent that, well, I will of course not attempt to replicate here, he said, you know, the problem with this debate is that Shakespeare demonstrates and authenticates his identity to me just like Santa Claus does, by the presence of presents on Christmas morning. And so what Karl was trying to say was, the important thing about Shakespeare is the plays, and the plays authenticate themselves for all the reasons that we know. They're beautiful, they're moving, they're compelling, right? And the question of who wrote them can justifiably take a back seat to the value that those plays give us as plays. And what I want to suggest to you today is that this is, in some sense, how we can orient ourselves to this text, and how Christians who have continued to do so have largely justified their own perspective there. Will some graduate student, find some manuscript in the sands of Turkey in 20, 40, 400 years that proves definitively who this person was? Maybe, yeah. And we'll leave that to the future to decide. But until then, the value that these texts have had for the churches for over 1,000 years is, I think, grounds enough for us to be very invested in the beauty that they convey and the help that they can give us. And so, like Santa, whose existence is proved by presents, and like Shakespeare, whose plays are authenticated by their beauty, not by who wrote them, I think that we can sort of zealously throw ourselves into this pseudo-Dionysian text and texts, not recklessly, not without a lack of concern for their authorship, but a recognition that the beauty of the ideas is really what we're after in the first place. And the last thing I want to say on that before we really leap into the ideas themselves and get oriented for next week, and then I'm going to shut up and we'll talk, is this. So in the ancient world, as someone like Kelsey, who's with us today and studies with one of our friends, Robin Jensen, who some of you may remember from days gone by, who is herself a brilliant medievalist in study of late antiquity. Robin was the one who first made me aware of the fact that in the ancient world and leading into the Middle Ages, there's a really common practice of writing a text in the voice of somebody else who is smarter, wiser, and more famous than you, right? And this is not something that is about creating forgeries. This is not something that's about trying to make a false claim about authorship. This is not a practice that was motivated by a desire to deceive, in short. This is a tradition across the ancient world, Christian and non-Christian, that very broadly speaking is, again, really about showing lines of continuity, demonstrating tradition, right? If I write a play that I say is written by William Shakespeare, right? And maybe I've got a little wink, something in the text indicate, okay, yeah, it's probably not by Shakespeare. Probably the reason I would do that would be to show that I'm trying to write a play like Shakespeare, right? And what I want to submit to you, like a lot of scholars of Dionysius have said, is that that's what's going on here. When the author of this text claims to be the one who was converted by Paul on the Areopagus. I don't think we have to hear that as somebody in the 6th century going, jokes on the future, it's not true, right? Fake ID. No, I think what we can see this as is somebody who is saying, I am situating myself in the mold of a holy authority of the church, and I am adopting the voice and the perspective and the tradition of that figure, and I'm trying to situate my thinking within that tradition, right? So I just offer you that as a way to think about this question of authorship. Maybe this isn't something we have to think about in terms of, is it a forgery or is it not? Like so many people did in the Renaissance. And maybe instead we can think about this not just as Santa who proves his existence with gifts to us, though we certainly should do that, but also as somebody who is maybe in great intellectual humility, taking on the voice of a Christian intellectual ancestor in order to try and situate a body of ideas in an authoritative witness of the church's past. So that's all we'll say about that. But that gives us some topsy-turvy introduction to who this mysterious person was from late antiquity, and why we are allowed to care, and why we should care. And now we can talk a little bit about what this guy has to say. And so I thank you for your patience as we finally move into the meat and the bones of what this person has to teach us. And so in order to get to that, I want to talk to you a little bit about this text that we're going to read, the Mystical Theology. We're going to read a translation that comes from this beautiful book, which is the Classics of Western Christianity edition of all of Pseudo-Dionysius's writings. As you can see, it's pretty thin. Even the longest of these texts is not very long. But we're going to read the Mystical Theology, which again is about 8 pages long. And that's one of the reasons we're going to read it, because it's short, thank goodness. But not only is it short, it's extremely representative of all 5 of those texts that I showed you at the beginning. This is like a kind of cliff notes that Pseudo-Dionysius gives of everything that he writes. So when you read this, you're going to know a lot more than most people do, who might even know something generally about the Pseudo-Dionysius, but have never bothered to read anything. In these 8 pages, you're going to get a real sense of the sort of height and depth of the big castle of his thought. And that's exciting. You know, it's not often that an intellectual of any kind does that for us, right? Like here's the 8 pages. If you read this, you kind of got a flavor of the whole thing. In this case, that's exactly what we have. So I'm going to send out a kind of study guide, as it were, to orient your reading, even though this is short. And what that study guide is going to look like is just exactly what I'm going to show you now. So I'm just going to make a suggestion for 2 things: what to look for when you're reading and what to ask yourself when you're reading. So first of all, he's going to talk about 3 kind of major themes, or rather, these are 3 things that I want you to think about when you're reading this short text. And by way of introducing them, I want to actually read to you this brief passage that comes from the 2nd chapter of this text that you're going to read. This is a very brief passage, won't take long, but it comes from the 2nd chapter, and it's a prayer. And in this prayer, Pseudo-Dionysius says this. He says, "I pray we would come to this darkness so far above light. If only we lacked sight and knowledge so as to see, so as to know, unseeing and unknowing, that which lies beyond all vision and knowledge. For this would be really to see and to know, to praise the transcendent one in a transcending way, namely through the denial of all beings. We would be like sculptors who set out to carve a statue. They remove every obstacle to the pure view of the hidden image, and simply by this act of clearing aside, they show up the beauty which is hidden." Now, hopefully that seems really strange and kind of confusing and appealing and kind of seductive, or some combination of those things. But I read that passage because it's got all of the elements in here that I think are representative of this text and why we care. Because working backwards from this list of 3, this list of 4, here's what I think finally is the big argument of this text and what we need to be concerned about. The Pseudo-Dionysius guy, or PD as I like to call him, gives us an argument about what God is that generates an argument about what humans can say. And I think that can be reframed this way. PD gives us a case about what God is that tells us something about what human beings can know. So there's a movement here, right, from one kind of argument to another kind of argument. And you're going to see that even in these short 8 pages. He's often going to toggle back and forth between these 2 layers. There's something to be said about God. And based on that thing, there are things to be said about what humans can say. So right off the bat, that's a concern about language, right? Human language and what can be said. Specifically, what human beings can say or can't say about God, right? So again, we're going to constantly move back and forth here between claims about God and then what that tells us as Christians about what we can and can't say about this God, right? So I keep saying what we can and can't say about God. What's that about? Well, let me just briefly give you a preview of these 2 layers of arguments as you're going to encounter them. What is it that PD thinks God is, right? What is this argument about God? Well, you'll discover it in its parts, but if we can talk about it in an overly general way, PD wants to say God is something that, to use a phrase some of you may have heard before, is not a being like other beings. God is not something somewhere inside creation. God is not lurking over there or over there, even sort of back behind the world, someone like the Wizard of Oz. And if we just sort of move behind the screen, hey, we'd find God. There he'd be, right? The big God guy. No, PD says that's not what God is. God is something that is not a thing at all, something that is fundamentally apart from, in some sense, the creation that he creates, but in so doing is completely intimate to it. And see, already we're using very confusing paradoxes, right? And language that grasps at things that are difficult to say. And that leads us already to this second layer. What can we say and not say about God based on the awareness that he's going to, the awareness that he's going to argue that God is something that is beyond and above and greater than everything within creation, right? That God is not just a supreme being. God is not a being at all, right? God is even beyond being itself, Pseudo-Dionysius wants to say. And if that just sounds really weird and difficult to imagine, that's exactly what Pseudo-Dionysius wants to talk about. It's hard to imagine. Close your eyes and try and imagine something that is greater than and excessive to everything that is. Well, you can't do that, right? Images have to do with particular things. So what can we say with individual words about God when God is not something that can easily be named? That's the big question for the mystical theology. How do we use words? Words like Jesus, words like bread, words like the true vine, words like the Ancient of Days, words like love, words like being. How do we use any of these words from scripture and tradition to describe a God that is bigger than and in excess of anything that language can describe? And newsflash, not to spoil the ending, but Pseudo-Dionysius is not going to say, well, everybody just go home, there's nothing to be said, and, you know, kind of get intimate with the darkness, and I don't know what to tell you, that's it. Right? Pseudo-Dionysius does not want to deprive you of your ability to say things about God and to name God. But he is going to try and get us to see that in order to do that, we might have to go beyond what we know about God and venture into what we don't know, that our unknowing of God, that our lack of knowledge about God is just as important for our love of God and intimacy with God as what we know about God. That's a long sentence. Let me try and reframe it one other way. For PD, he's going to try and get us to see that we can say things about God in all kinds of ways that are the result of our reflection on how God goes beyond what we can know. And the good news is we can still love what we don't know fully. I want to say that again because I think that is so important to understanding this text. Humans have the capacity given by God to love a God who they cannot fully understand. And in fact, entering into our non-knowing, our lack of understanding, can actually be one way that we come to love God and experience God. And that is why I entitled this session, Loving God in the Dark, because Pseudo-Dionysius wants to talk all the time about light and darkness, knowledge and obscurity, how God is present to us and absent from us. And so I invite you to look at that when you're reading this short text. And lastly, I'm going to send out these questions, but before I shut up and in the last 10 minutes we talk to each other, here are a couple of questions that I think can orient your reading. Because, guys, I've been reading this stuff for years. I love PD, and he's still bizarre and confusing to me. So if you come to this and you think it's strange and weird and a little wacky and you're confused, then good, it's working. And don't worry about that, because that's why we're doing this together, because we need each other to be able to make heads and tails of this stuff. So I would invite you to think about these questions. First of all, how does PD's description of God resonate with your own thoughts and experience? So as you're reading this, and he says things about God being bigger than any being, bigger than being itself, when you read phrases like God is a super-luminous darkness, when you see these descriptions of God that maybe are not so familiar to you, or maybe very familiar to you, I invite you to just consider, is this resonating? Is this tracking? Do you find light bulb moments happen where you go, oh yeah, that kind of sticks to something I've always thought but hadn't expressed, or maybe you had expressed. Or maybe you read something and go, I don't know, I'm kind of with Martin Luther on this. I think he might be more of a Platonist than a Christian here, or something, right? So maybe keep track of those things in your own mind. And if you're the kind of person who likes homework, which I don't, then maybe note some of those things, jot something down for us next time, and feel free to come to the experience and say things like, I was really, really bothered by this paragraph, both because I didn't understand it, and to the extent that I did, it seemed like a really bad idea. That's great stuff. Also feel free to say things like, wow, this paragraph is beautiful and wonderful, and it seems really true. Also, I don't know what I'm reading. Secondly, how are God and humans related in this text? Are they strangers? Are they friends? Are they on some kind of journey together? What kind of journey? Think about that. And yes, and now you see the architecture of my PowerPoint because it's over. So I'm going to get that down, and I'm going to stop screen sharing for a moment, if I can do that. And I'm going to just briefly summarize a couple of things before I shut up. First is the enduring value of this text that we're going to read, I would submit to you, is that it's going to give us some tools for how to think about what God is and what that tells us about our expectations for what we can say about God. Secondly, I think it's an important text because it places real value on what we don't know, on our ignorance, on the limits of our knowledge for loving God. I think in the Western Catholic tradition, we do a really good job, often with the aid of brilliant people like Thomas Aquinas, of thinking about how our knowledge, our reason, helps us to come close to God. That's good. But that same tradition, in other corners, equally emphasizes the importance and the value of what we can't know, of non-knowing, of ways in which the love of and for God goes beyond what we can know. And then finally, I think that the importance of this 8-page thing we're going to read is it helps us to get those two things together. It helps us think about how we can still say things about God, even if we come to acknowledge that there are these real limits on what can be known. And maybe, just maybe, we can come to experience that lack of knowledge as a kind of freedom, a liberation, not a sort of terrifying darkness where there's this just fundamental limit, as if there were this person we wanted to love, but we couldn't see them. But rather, like Pseudo-Dionysius wants to say, a super-luminous darkness, a strange paradoxical place where by going further than what we know, we can learn to speak our love in a certain kind of way. And I see many people here who I'm going to assume are couples, and as someone who's in a relationship with somebody who happens to be on this call, I would say that if you've ever been in a romantic relationship, or observed a good one, then you kind of know something that Pseudo-Dionysius is talking about. I'll conclude by saying, some of you may have seen that great Ron Howard movie, A Beautiful Mind, about John Nash, the mathematician. And there's a great scene in it where the mathematician goes to a date with his girlfriend, Alicia, and he's going to propose to her, but he's super nervous. And he's a mathematician. And he says, Alicia, I need some kind of certainty. I need some kind of verifiable data here about our love, right? And she says, okay. And she takes a deep breath and she says, John, the universe, is it infinite? He says, yes. He says, okay, you know this is a mathematician. The universe is infinite. How do you know that? And he says, I don't know. I just believe it. And she looks at him very seductively and says, well, I guess that's how our love is, right? And I think what she's saying there is something that's not just sentimental, but is deeply true about experiences of love, right? You love people far further than you know them, right? As Wendell Berry says in one of his marriage poems, how else could it be that you, my wife, and I keep surprising each other with things that we didn't know about each other, right? And I see some of you smiling, like you maybe understand this experience, right? So Pseudo-Dionysius, treat the way he talks about God and humanity like I've just been talking about lovers, right? That sometimes by loving beyond what we can know about something, we actually open up new horizons of love itself. And that's what we're going to talk about. So with the last 7 minutes, I'm going to make good on that long overdue promise to shut up and ask for any kinds of questions that want to clarify anything about this smorgasbord of history that I threw about you, questions about this person, Pseudo-Dionysius, questions about ideas that came up just in the course of hearing about this language God stuff, questions about what to expect for next week. Floor's open. Anybody got thoughts, questions, snide remarks?
John, Bob O'Gorman here. You got great friends. This guy is terrific. Jacob, I really appreciate it. Hey, the question that I would throw out, I don't know that it's a particularly significant one, but it's one that's in the back of my head. It has to do with this confidence, that the church, Martin Luther, and all the rest of us have in reading PD.
Yeah.
Could you compare where we are now, where you are, of confidence in reading PD to confidence in reading the Gospel of Thomas? Elaine Pagel several years ago has tried to raise that confidence for us. I'm not sure that's ever happened, and so I'm just wondering, if there's any knowledge in comparing those two.
This is a great question, and thank you for those kind comments. I think here's what I would say to that. Generally, yes, in the sense that in both cases, what you have is somebody who is trying to get us to reappraise a text that maybe hasn't been fully appreciated based on the sort of qualities of the text itself, rather than the question of authorship, right? And I think that is a really good comparison there. Where maybe I would want to spitball a place where I think that comparison is different, or where it breaks down a little bit, is, Pagel's is very justifiably, I mean, she's great at what she does. And I think, Pagel's is trying to speak predominantly from a historical perspective, like a philologist, trying to say, well, here's where the text comes from, here's what it does, here's how it's interacting with other texts in its moment. And in some ways, everybody from Martin Luther to us right now, I think that we're trying to go a step further than that, insofar as we're trying to say, okay, but how do these texts enter into continuity or discontinuity with what we believe as practicing and believing Christians of a certain kind? And that gets kind of recursive real fast, right? Because as I think your question is trying to suggest, well, okay, we set up these canons of texts that are allowed, right? And that sort of determines what we believe. But then we leave some stuff out. And then the question is, well, then can we loop some of this stuff back in? Obviously, that's a huge can of worms about canonicity and authority that we can't possibly hope to open. But what I do want to say is, I want to affirm a sense that there is real excitement in recovering this figure who hasn't always been appreciated as well as he should have, in a way that I do think maps onto the good work Pagels is doing. But I would also say that part of the reason we can say that, I mean, this is back to the idea of Santa proves his existence by presence, right? One of the presence of these texts is they give us some really rich fodder for encountering devotional questions, practical questions, spiritual questions, intellectual questions as Christians. And of course, the Gospel of Thomas can do that for us too. But without sort of addressing that question head on, I would just want to say that I think that what's distinctive here, at least in how I'm trying to pitch PD, is that he is eminently sort of useful and helpful as a partner of dialogue in how we form Christian ideas about questions of how we speak about God and the limits of that. If we want to have a reading group about the Gospel of Thomas down the road to see if we can squeeze something out of that mill too, then we'll do it. I have two questions here in the chat. Rose asked, you're curious if Merton took some of his theology from Pseudo-Dionysius. And the answer to that is yes. And actually, John is chiming in here, right, that there is a conversance there. Excuse me, I got some water way down the wrong pipe. Not Corona. But yeah, I would really encourage anybody to consult what John's saying here, mystics and Zen masters. And then at a subtler level in New Seats of Contemplation, you definitely see that influence in a big way. And we're going to talk a lot on the back end of all this about influence. I mean, it's a long list, y'all, from Merton and then working backwards to, John of the Cross and Carmelite spirituality and all of these Reformed and Catholic figures in the Reformations, and then Alan of Lille and all these medieval figures in the 12th century. So the influence is deep and broad. And yes, Merton is definitely tapped into that. And then Steve Meyer says, has PD been read and followed all over these centuries? Is there currently a renewed interest in him? Yes. Okay, good question. So the quick answer here is he has not been read with equal continuity in all parts of the world. So particularly in the Latin West, there have been some real lacunae, some real moments where he hasn't been in circulation. Part of that, and someone like Kelsey can probably speak to this with even more detail. Part of that is because there's a real collapse of learning of Greek that happens after the fall of the Western Empire for several centuries. And so you have an interest in Pseudo-Dionysius, but his texts aren't in circulation broadly. And to the extent that they are, he's not often translated well. So the first sort of like the cliff notes here is in the 830s, I think, you have a monk who translates Pseudo-Dionysius from Greek into Latin. But that text is quickly supplanted by the sort of new authoritative translation in the mid 800s of a theologian named Duns Scotus Eriugena, whose name delightfully means John the Irishman from Ireland, who comes down to France to the Carolingian court. And he's a really dope philosopher who's really sort of the first philosopher of Northern Europe. He's not just rehearsing old ideas, he's saying new things. And he translates the whole corpus in a way that makes possible this renewed interest in him. But again, there's a lag there. It doesn't really happen again until like the 1100s, over 300 years after he translates. So I would love to talk more about this. And if you have time to stick around after 1130, it's got a lot of interesting chapters as a story, but I can summarize it by saying there are two big factors that cause the discontinuity in when he is read and not read. One of them is, do people have the ability to translate his texts into Latin or other languages in a given moment in history? And the second is this guy seen as too theologically controversial to be licitly read or not? And that's why, for example, you have evidence of manuscripts containing his work, for example, in monasteries in the High Middle Ages, but no monastic commentary on them, sometimes for decades or over 100 years. And more on that for another time, but it's a rich story. Yeah. John, I know that we need to stop hard at 11:30. Should we kind of formally break for now and see if anyone wants to stick around?
Let's talk real quick. I'm getting a practical question. So how should we plan for folks to get both your PowerPoint deck, which may be helpful, and also this text?
I'll send you the latter, and I will send you a PDF of the former no later than tomorrow, Monday. And
Okay.
If I can rely on you to circulate that, or if you want to give me emails, I'm glad to do that as well.
No, the easiest way, everyone, is I will put this on the website. So if you go to ctk.org, which I'm putting up in the chat, slash, find this, adult formation, again, coming up in the chat. I will simply put it there. You can see the, if you go there, you can see that we have a little blurb about these presentations. It will be there by the end of the day tomorrow as downloadable links.
Perfect. Perfect.
Well, yeah, let's call this our hard stop. And those of you who want can stick around and ask more questions. But let's unmute ourselves and show our appreciation for Jake's time this morning and the next 2 weeks.
Thank you, sir.
Appreciate it.